Further evidence that whatever else was happening, Joseph Smith was not simply reading from a manuscript comes from an episode recounted by David Whitmer to William H. Kelly and G.A. Blakesley in January of 1882. He could not translate unless he was humble and possessed the right feelings towards everyone. To illustrate so you can see, one morning when he was getting ready to continue the translation, something went wrong about the house, and he was put out about it, something that Emma, his wife, had done. Oliver and I went upstairs, this is David Whitmer speaking, and Joseph came up soon thereafter to continue the translation, but he could not do anything. He could not translate a single syllable. He went downstairs, out into the orchard, and made supplication to the Lord, was gone about an hour, came back to the house, asked Emma's forgiveness, and then came upstairs where we were, and the translation went on all right. He could do nothing save he was humble and faithful. Whitmer gave the same account to a correspondent for the Omaha Herald during an interview on the 10th of October of 1886. The newspaper relates of the prophet with slightly fervid language. He went into the woods again to pray, and this time was gone fully an hour. His friends became positively concerned, and were about to institute a search, when Joseph entered the room, pale and haggard, having suffered a vigorous chastisement at the hands of the Lord. He went straight in humiliation to his wife, entreated and received her forgiveness, returned to his work, and much to the joy of himself and his anxious friends surrounding him, the stone again glared forth its letters of fire. Now, it would seem from this anecdote that Joseph needed to be in some way spiritually or emotionally ready for the translation process to proceed, something that would have been wholly unnecessary if he'd simply been reading from a prepared manuscript. As David Whitmer explained, Joseph occasionally, quote, found he was spiritually blind and could not translate. He told us that his mind dwelt too much on earthly things, and various causes would make him incapable of proceeding with the translation. Now at this point, of course, a skeptic might perhaps suggest that emotional distractions interfered with Joseph's ability to remember a text that he had memorized the night before for dictation to his naive secretaries, or that personal upheavals hindered his improvising of an original text for them to write down as it occurred to him. Such potential counter-explanations run into their own serious difficulties. Whether it's even remotely plausible, for example, to imagine Joseph Smith or anybody else memorizing or composing nearly 5,000 words daily, day after day, week after week, in the production of a lengthy and complex book, is a question that people can ponder for themselves. I'll simply say that as someone who writes much and rapidly, I tend to publish first drafts, and who has kept a daily record of how many words I produce each day over the past 5 years, I've never come close to maintaining such a pace, even on computer. I have about 4 book manuscripts at various stages of production right now. I've got a lot of stuff that I'm working on, but I've never come anywhere close to this, even on a computer. I find the scenario for anybody, to say nothing of the poorly educated Joseph Smith, extraordinarily implausible. An anecdote related or recounted by Martin Harris to Edward Stevenson seems to argue against the translation process being either the simple dictation of a memorized text or the mechanical reading of an ordinary manuscript surreptitiously smuggled into the room. Harris is speaking about the earliest days of the work, before the arrival of Oliver Cowdery, when he was serving as scribe. Harris, quote, said that the prophet possessed a seer stone by which he was enabled to translate as well as from the Orem and Thummim, and for convenience he then used the seer stone. Now, obviously, the scribes needed light in order to be able to write the text down. By way of contrast, that pun is intended, Joseph seems to have needed to dim the ambient light so as to make the deliverances of the seer stone easier to see. Imagine looking into a computer screen all day long with bright, glaring light behind the computer. Your eyes would soon tire. Accordingly, the stone was placed into a hat in which the prophet put his face. This situation, coupled with the lack of a dividing curtain, would obviously have made it very difficult, if not impossible, for Joseph to have concealed a manuscript or books, or even the plates themselves. It would also have made it effectively impossible for him to read from a manuscript somehow placed at the bottom of the darkened hat. I mean, think about this. If you're excluding the light, and you've got a written text at the bottom of the hat, you can't see it. Okay? So there's got to be something in there that provides some light, or else he's making it up, which again I find implausible. Stevenson's account continues. By aid of the seer stone, sentences would appear and were read by the prophet and written by Martin. And when finished, he would say, written. And if correctly written, that sentence would disappear and another appear in its place. But if not written correctly, it remained until corrected. So the translation was just as it was engraven on the plates, precisely in the language then used. Martin said after continued translation, they would become weary, and they'd go down to the river and exercise by throwing stones out on the river and so forth. While so doing, on one occasion, Martin found a stone very much resembling the one used for translating. and on resuming their labor of translation, Martin put in place the stone that he had found. He said the prophet remained silent, unusually and intently gazing in darkness, no traces of the usual sentences appearing. Much surprised, Joseph exclaimed, "Martin, what's the matter? All is as dark as Egypt." Now, I don't know exactly why he thought Egypt was dark, but I'll leave that. Martin's countenance betrayed him, and the prophet asked Martin why he had done so. Martin said, "To stop the mouths of fools," who had told him the prophet had learned these sentences and was merely repeating them. Well, that is a pretty good test. I mean, clearly that wasn't what was going on. He needed some particular instrument to do what he was doing, and it wasn't there. But he hadn't even noticed the change. It just wasn't working. Furthermore, I'm going to shift gears here a little bit. It's clear from careful analysis of the original manuscript that Joseph did not know in advance what the text was going to say. So if he had memorized something, this is a bit of a surprise. It's a surprise that it's a surprise to him. Chapter breaks and book divisions apparently surprised him. He would see some indication, evidently, of a break in the text, and in each case would tell his scribe to write chapter. The numbers were then added later. For instance, of what we now recognize as the end of 1 Nephi. The original manuscript first indicates merely that a new chapter is about to begin. In the original chapter divisions, that upcoming text was marked as chapter 7, Roman numeral 7. When Joseph and Oliver subsequently discovered that they were instead at the opening of a wholly distinct book, 2 Nephi, the chapter heading was crossed out, and a more appropriate heading was inserted. This is quite instructive, I think. It indicates that Joseph could only see the end of a section, but didn't know whether the next section would be another portion of the same book, or instead, the commencement of an entirely new book. You seeing where I'm going with this? That he's reading from something, but it's something he hasn't seen before. He doesn't know what's coming. This is not a text he'd composed. It's not a text that he was familiar with. It wasn't one that he was making up, because he himself is surprised. It's something outside his mind. Moreover, there were parts of the text that he did not understand. When he came to proper names he could not pronounce, or long words, recalled his wife Emma, the earliest part of the translation, he spelled them out. And she evidently mentioned her experience to David Whitmer. When Joseph could not pronounce the words, Whitmer told Edmund C. Briggs and Rudolf Etzenhauser in 1884, he spelled them out letter by letter. Briggs also recalled an 1856 interview with Emma Smith in which she remarked to her husband Joseph's limited education while he was translating the Book of Mormon, and she was scribe at the time. He could not pronounce the word Sariah. This is Emma speaking. And one time while translating, where it speaks of the walls of Jerusalem, he stopped and said, "Emma, did Jerusalem have walls surrounding it?" When I informed him it had, he replied, "Oh, I thought I was deceived." As the Chicago Tribune summarized David Whitmer's testimony in 1885, he confirmed Emma's experience. In translating the characters, Smith, who was illiterate and but little versed in biblical lore, was oftentimes compelled to spell the words out, not knowing the correct pronunciation. And Mr. Whitmer recalls the fact that at that time, Smith did not even know that Jerusalem was a walled city. Now, by the way, the use of the term illiterate is potentially misleading here. Joseph was literate, given the now current meaning of the word, but because he could read and write. But he wasn't a learned person in that sense. That's what it's meaning. He wasn't a man of letters. In its notice of the death of David Whitmer, and undoubtedly based upon its prior interviews with him, the 24 January 1888 issue of the Chicago Times again alluded to the difficulties Joseph had with the text he was dictating. Quote, "Smith, being an illiterate, would often stumble over the big words, which the village schoolmaster, Oliver Cowdery, would pronounce for him, and so the work proceeded." So this doesn't sound like something Joseph wrote, because there were words in it he didn't know. There were names he couldn't read. Thus we see that Joseph Smith appears to have been reading from something external to himself, but that he had no book or manuscript or paper with him. It seems to have been a text that was new and strange to him, one that required a certain emotional or mental focus before it could be read. All of this is entirely consistent with Joseph's claim that he was deriving the text by revelation, by the power of God, through an interpreting device. But it doesn't seem reconcilable with claims that he created the text himself earlier, or even that he was merely reading from a purloined copy of someone else's manuscript. In order to make the latter theories plausible, it's necessary to reject the unanimous testimony of the eyewitnesses to the process, and to ignore the evidence provided by a careful examination and study of the original manuscript itself. It's also necessary, of course, to interpret away the testimony of the witnesses of the Book of Mormon plates. On the whole, traditional frontal attacks on the sanity and character of those witnesses have gone out of favor. The evidence simply doesn't sustain such charges. Much more common now is the claim that the witnesses were somehow, owing to their religious credulity, their fanaticism, at least intermittently disconnected from daily reality. Time doesn't permit an exhaustive analysis of this currently fashionable approach. which is sometimes, apparently just to be on the safe side, linked with vague suggestions that Joseph might, maybe, perhaps, have helped his gullible friends along with some actual forged plates, as well as a forged sword of Laban, a bogus Liahona, a fake breastplate, a stage prop seer stone, Urim and Thummim, goes on and on and on. I'll simply say that I'm deeply unimpressed by these ideas, which strike me as ideologically driven, embarrassingly tendentious, and desperately ad hoc.